The air smelled like wet earth and revenge. I stood on the cracked edge of the dam, boots sinking into the soft gravel, my hands gripping the rusted control lever. Below me, Lake Thornfield stretched like a sheet of glass, moonlight shimmering over water that had witnessed 3 generations of my family's memories. Behind me, Vivian Blackwood's luxury resort blazed with lights, a $1.8 million monument to arrogance and greed. And in less than 5 minutes, I was about to drain every last drop of it. My radio crackled. "Garrett, you don't have to do this," Marcus whispered. "Yes, I do," I muttered, my voice low, steady, and cold. I thought about my grandfather's stone bridge, the bridge she demolished without permission, calling it aesthetic garbage. That bridge wasn't just rocks and mortar. It was where my father proposed to my mother in 1967, where I knelt in 1998, shaking and stuttering when I asked Sarah to marry me, and now Sarah was gone. But that bridge had been my last connection to her, and Vivian thought she could erase it. I looked across the lake at her glass-walled palace, where she stood on the balcony sipping wine, confident in her power. Months ago, she laughed in my face, saying, "You can't touch us, Garrett. We have lawyers, we have money, and we have power." 3 months later, her power was about to sink into 30 feet of mud. The lever groaned as I pulled it down. A deep rumble rolled through the earth, like the roar of something ancient waking from a long sleep. Then, from the spillways below, water exploded outward in violent torrents. Within minutes, the lake began to recede. Boats scraped against rocks, docks tilted, and Vivian's pristine shoreline turned into cracked, ugly wasteland. Her security guards screamed into radios. Her investors panicked, but it was already too late. I exhaled slowly, watching the chaos unfold. "Why, I should have left the bridge alone," I whispered. "And if you want to know how I drained an entire $1 million lake and brought down an HOA empire armed with lawyers, threats, and endless money, stick around. This is the story of how one man, a stone bridge, and a 70-year-old dam changed everything." Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, because the next time an HOA tries to control your life, you'll want to know exactly how to fight back. I never wanted a war. All I wanted was to sit on my grandfather's stone bridge at sunrise, sip my coffee, and listen to the quiet slap of water against the old oak pilings. Lake Thornfield had been my family's sanctuary for 3 generations. Every crack in that weathered bridge told a story of my grandfather's calloused hands laying stone during the Great Depression, of my father proposing to my mother there in 1967, of the day I knelt on those same stones and asked Sarah to marry me while autumn leaves drifted around us like fiery confetti. But peace doesn't last when money smells water. Vivian Blackwood arrived like a storm front in a designer suit. Fresh from her second divorce, Connecticut money burning a hole in her pocket, she bought the glass and steel monstrosity on the Western Bank for $2.3 million and declared herself president of the newly formed Thornfield Lakeside HOA. Within months, she had beautification initiatives, uniform property standards, and a gaggle of developer friends calling the shots. I was just the grumpy vet in the fishing cabin to them. The violation letter came one humid July morning, slipped under my door like a death sentence. My grandfather's bridge, they claimed, was structurally unsound and aesthetic non-compliance. 60 days to demolish it or face escalating fines. I remember standing on that bridge after reading it, fingertips grazing the cool stone as sunlight shimmered on the lake. I'd buried Sarah 6 months earlier, and this bridge was the one place I still felt close to her. They weren't just trying to erase rock and mortar. They were erasing her laughter, my childhood, my family's legacy. I tried reasoning with Vivian at the HOA meeting that night. It was held at her lakeside resort in progress, a monstrosity of glass and cedar meant to lure wealthy tourists. Inside, everything reeked of varnish and pow. "It's a historical structure," I told her, keeping my voice even. "My grandfather built it in 1935. It's safe. It's sound. You don't get to—" Vivian cut me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Garrett, darling, we're building a brand. Your rustic aesthetic doesn't fit our vision. Progress waits for no one. The room laughed. Her cronies nodded. I walked out without another word, but that night, sitting on my porch, I made a vow. If Vivian Blackwood wanted a war, she'd chosen the wrong damn soldier. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while Vivian bought her lakeside palace and her luxury resort, I had quietly inherited something far more valuable. I didn't just inherit the cabin. I inherited the dam that made Lake Thornfield exist in the first place. And I knew exactly how to use it. When I was 12, my grandfather sat me down on the stone bridge one misty morning and told me a secret that would change my life decades later. He tapped the weathered railing with his gnarled knuckles and said, "Garrett, this bridge isn't just stone and mortar. It's a promise. And promises, they're worth fighting for." Then he pulled out a worn leather folder. Inside were documents older than him, yellowed deeds, survey maps, water rights agreements sealed by the county clerk back in 1951. "This dam," he said, pointing to the map where a thick blue line carved Thornfield Valley in two, "was built by my hands and the hands of men like me. We paid for it, we maintained it, and we own the water rights. Remember that, boy. Someday, someone's going to try and take this place from you." I didn't understand then, but I do now. Vivian's resort project wasn't just about fancy vacation rentals and overpriced boat slips. She was gambling everything on lakefront exclusivity. And my dam stood directly in the crosshairs of her plans. Without a stable lake, her entire $1.8 million resort investment would crumble into dust. The irony? She didn't even know I owned the keys to her empire's foundation. I spent weeks digging through the old legal archives, confirming what my grandfather told me. The rights weren't just intact, they were bulletproof. Every inch of Lake Thornfield, every shimmering reflection of sunrise on its surface, existed because my family allowed it. And more importantly, I discovered something Vivian hadn't planned for. The county's environmental compliance laws required periodic drainage of artificial lakes to prevent ecological collapse. Translation? I had full legal authority to open the spillway and lower the water whenever I saw fit, and Vivian couldn't stop me. The first time I hinted at this during an HOA meeting, you could practically hear the oxygen leave the room. Vivian's smile froze, her knuckles whitening around her clipboard. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. "Try me," I said. From that day forward, everything escalated. First came the fines. Hundreds, then thousands of dollars for non-compliance. I ignored them. Then came the harassment. Code inspectors showing up unannounced. Strangers trespassing on my property to evaluate safety. Anonymous complaints filed with the county. Vivian weaponized bureaucracy like a scalpel. But she underestimated two things: my military patience and my absolute willingness to burn my own comfort to the ground if it meant protecting my family's legacy. By October, I'd assembled a war chest: environmental studies, engineering assessments, legal precedents. I contacted Jake Morrison, an environmental reporter with the County Herald, and explained my plan: drain the lake, restore the ecosystem, and expose Vivian's resort for what it really was: an ecological disaster in designer packaging. He listened carefully, scribbled notes, then leaned back and smiled. "You're about to make a lot of enemies, Donovan." I sighed, upped my coffee, and looked him dead in the eye. Good, because enemies I could handle. What I couldn't handle was losing the last thing connecting me to Sarah, to my grandfather, to the only place that had ever truly felt like home. That's when I began preparing the nuclear option. I inspected the dam personally: concrete walls as thick as my resolve, gears rusted but operational, spillway gates that hadn't been moved in 20 years. I hired contractors to service the hydraulics and calibrate the monitoring equipment. Everything had to be airtight. And then, one cold November morning, I filed Form 27B with the State Environmental Agency, formally notifying them of a scheduled drainage operation set for Memorial Day weekend. I'll never forget the look on Vivian's face when she got the letter. She stormed onto my property in stilettos and a white linen blouse, hair perfectly pinned, rage simmering just beneath her polished veneer. "You son of a bitch," she spat. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" Restoring balance, I said calmly. This will ruin me, she screamed. I leaned against the bridge railing, arms folded, and said the quiet part out loud. That's the point. For the first time since she'd shown up in Thornfield, Vivian had no comeback. She just stood there, trembling, before stomping back to her Tesla. That's when I knew this wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was war, and I was going to win. The first real shot in the war came 2 weeks later. I woke up to the sound of shouting outside my cabin. At first, I thought it was just deer hunters arguing over trespassing rights again. But when I stepped out onto the porch, barefoot and holding a mug of lukewarm coffee, I saw 3 county code enforcement trucks parked at the foot of my driveway. 5 inspectors in reflective vests were pacing around, pointing at my bridge, my dock, even the damn mailbox, jotting things down on clipboards like vultures circling fresh roadkill. The lead inspector, a young guy who couldn't have been older than 25, looked up at me nervously. Mr. Donovan, we've received several complaints from the HOA about potential code violations on your property. We're here to conduct a full inspection. I almost laughed. On whose authority? Thornfield Lake HOA, he said, his voice cracking ever so slightly. I sipped my coffee, let the silence stretch, and finally said, That's cute, but this property is outside HOA jurisdiction, always has been. Check the county plat map. His face flushed crimson. He flipped through his packet, and sure enough, there it was. My land, carved out like a stubborn island, excluded from HOA control since the dam was first built in 1951. Behind him, a black Range Rover rolled up, and out stepped Vivian Sinclair in full battle regalia, cream-colored pantsuit, oversized sunglasses, and a smirk sharp enough to draw blood. Garrett, she purred like we were old friends. It would have been so much easier if you'd just cooperated. I set my mug down on the railing and crossed my arms. Funny, I was just thinking the same thing. Her smirk vanished. You're forcing my hand, she said, loud enough for the inspectors to hear. If you move forward with your stunt, you'll be facing lawsuits, injunctions, and fines that'll bankrupt you. Then you'd better get busy filing, I said. That was the moment her mask cracked, just a hair. Her jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw what was really behind all that polish and designer charm: desperation. Vivian wasn't just trying to control the lake. She needed this resort to succeed. Badly. By the end of the week, I'd received 4 official code violation notices, all baseless, all from Vivian's cronies on the HOA board. 2 anonymous complaints to the county environmental office accusing me of illegally modifying Protex, TED wetlands. 1 hand-delivered warning letter threatening legal action if I interfered with community recreational resources. I kept every single piece of paper, stacking them neatly into a binder I labeled Vivian's Stupidity, Volume 1. But Vivian wasn't done. She launched a PR campaign against me. Glossy mailers sent to every homeowner around the lake, painting me as some unhinged loner hell-bent on destroying community harmony. The worst part? It worked. Within a month, half my neighbors were glaring at me like I'd personally poisoned their wells. One guy, Doug Whitman, who lived 2 houses down, even stopped me in the grocery store parking lot. You can't just drain the damn lake, Garrett, he said, jabbing a finger into my chest. We bought this place for the water, not a mud pit. I stared him down and said, Doug, you didn't buy the water. You bought a house. Learn the difference. Word spread fast after that. Thornfield wasn't just divided, it was splintered. People took sides like civilians choosing uniforms before a civil war. Old-timers, folks who'd been here for decades, backed me. They understood the lake's history, its ecosystem, its fragility. New money? They were all in with Vivian. They'd bought into her glossy vision of luxury living, and they weren't about to watch their property values evaporate because some stubborn veteran wouldn't play along. The tension simmered until one night I caught movement near the dam on my security cameras. 2 men in dark hoodies trying to tamper with the hydraulic control panel. I grabbed my shotgun and drove down in my truck, headlights cutting through the fog. By the time I arrived, they were gone, but not before cutting the wires on my monitoring equipment. I reported it to Deputy Santos the next morning. Sabotage, he said, shaking his head. This is getting out of hand. I nodded. Well, it's only the beginning, because I wasn't backing down. If Vivian wanted war, she'd picked the wrong battlefield. What she didn't realize was that every complaint she filed, every petty stunt she pulled, only strengthened my case. I documented everything, cataloging it like evidence in a military operation. And while she burned money on lawyers and PR firms, I doubled down on science. I hired environmental consultants, brought in hydrologists, and gathered irrefutable data showing that periodic drainage wasn't just legal, it was necessary to save the ecosystem. I was turning Vivian's own playbook against her. By February, Jake Morrison's first article hit the front page of the County Herald. Veteran fights HOA over lake stewardship, science versus luxury. The tide of public opinion started to shift. And that's when Vivian escalated again. This time, in ways I couldn't have imagined. Because the next thing I knew, Homeland Security was knocking on my door. The knock on my door at 6:15 a.m. wasn't just loud. It was official. 3 heavy raps, evenly spaced, like someone pounding a gavel straight into my soul. I opened it to find 2 men in dark suits standing on my porch, flanked by a uniformed deputy I recognized from the county sheriff's office. The taller of the suits flashed a badge so fast I barely caught the lettering. "Mr. Donovan," he said, "we're with Homeland Security. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your activities at Lake Thornfield." For a full second, I thought I'd misheard him. "Homeland Security? What the hell are you doing here?" "Sir," the other agent said, "we received an anonymous tip that you may be preparing to sabotage critical infrastructure, specifically the Thornfield Dam." That's when it hit me. Vivian. She hadn't just filed petty complaints, mailed out glossy propaganda, or sent goons to vandalize my equipment. No, she'd gone nuclear, accusing me of plotting domestic terrorism. I laughed, actually laughed. The taller agent didn't. "To appreciate it. This isn't funny, Mr. Donovan. The dam is classified as part of regional water security infrastructure. Any attempt to interfere with its operation without authorization is a federal matter." "Great," I said. "Then you'll be thrilled to know that I have authorization." I walked them into my cabin, past stacks of engineering manuals, environmental impact reports, and permit filings spread across the table like a war room. I handed the lead agent a copy of my state-issued environmental compliance notice, the one Rebecca Sterling and I had filed weeks ago. He studied it for a long minute before lowering his voice. "This is airtight." The other agent frowned. "Then why did we get the tip?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. By the time they left, the sheriff's deputy gave me a subtle nod. "Careful, Garrett," he said under his breath. "She's not playing fair anymore." Vivian's smear campaign went into overdrive after that. The next week, a concerned citizens group popped up on Facebook called Save Thornfield Lake. Its entire feed was anti-me. Grainy photos of me at the dam, wild accusations about me draining the community's future, and half-baked claims that I was working with downstate developers to destroy property values. Every post was dripping with outrage, and every comment section looked like a virtual mob. Then came the local TV segment. A reporter from Channel 6 News stood on Vivian's resort property, microphone in hand, while she delivered her performance like a Broadway star. "We're just trying to build a beautiful, sustainable community here at Lake Thornfield. But some people, like Mr. Garrett Donovan, are willing to destroy this natural treasure for their own selfish agendas." They aired it during prime time. By the next morning, I had 30 voicemails from neighbors, all variations of, "What the hell are you doing, G. Garrett?" The pressure worked on some of them. Property owners who'd once stood by me now avoided eye contact at the general store. A few even started siding openly with Vivian, fearing their investments were at risk. But here's the thing Vivian didn't understand. I'd been under pressure before. Real pressure. I'd led combat engineers through IED-riddled valleys in Kandahar, rebuilt bridges under sniper fire, and managed air evacuations with seconds to spare. A PR war? Please. I dug in deeper. Rebecca and I doubled our filings, submitting every report, every study, every data point to the State Environmental Quality Board. Marcus Anderson, my ace-in-the-hole environmental inspector, secured an official ruling confirming that lowering lake levels for seasonal restoration was state-recommended best practice. Once that ruling hit the county record, Vivian's legal strategy was crippled, but she wasn't done throwing punches. One night, Walt called me from his pickup, whispering like he was behind enemy lines. "G, you need to get down here, now." I drove out to the dam and found him crouched behind a boulder. Down by the spillway, three men in black hoodies were unloading concrete sacks and rebar from the back of a flatbed truck. "Are they?" I whispered. "Yeah," Walt said. "They're trying to sabotage the auxiliary controls. If they jam the spillway with concrete, you can't drain a damn drop." My jaw clenched. "Vivian sent them." "Prove it later," Walt said. "Right now, we need to stop them." I snapped photos, filmed video, and called Santos on speed dial. By the time the deputies arrived, the crew was gone, but they left the evidence behind. It was enough to trigger a county investigation. Vivian denied everything, of course, all smiles and pearls on the evening news, but for the first time, cracks were forming in her perfect image. Jake Morrison picked up the story. For the County Herald, sabotage at Lake Thornfield, tempers flare in HOA war. Public sentiment began shifting back, little by little, and that's when we discovered something that changed everything. Vivian's resort wasn't just over budget, it was over-leveraged to the breaking point. If I drained the lake, even partially, her investors would pull out, her loans would default, and her empire would collapse overnight. Suddenly, the battlefield wasn't just physical or legal, it was financial. And I was holding the detonator. The next morning, Rebecca Sterling spread out a stack of documents on her mahogany conference table like a general unrolling battlefield maps. Her office smelled faintly of leather-bound case files and strong coffee, a place where lives were quietly ruined using nothing more than paperwork. "These," she said, tapping the first folder, "are Vivian's loan covenants." I frowned. "You got these legally?" She smirked. "Public records, Garrett. You'd be amazed what developers forget becomes public when they file for high-interest financing." Walt leaned over her shoulder, whistling low. "Holy hell. She's borrowed against everything. Her Greenwich mansion, her Tesla, 3 separate Connecticut properties." "And," Rebecca said, flipping to the next page, "the entire Lakeside Resort project itself is funded through leveraged balloon loans." I raised an eyebrow. "Balloon loans?" Marcus, sitting in the corner nursing his 4th cup of coffee, explained it in his calm, methodical tone. "Short-term loans with low initial payments but massive lump sums due later. They're poison if cash flow stumbles even slightly." Rebecca nodded. "Exactly, and here's the kicker. The contracts require her to maintain premier lakefront destination status through development. No lake access, no destination. No destination, no funding." Walt grinned like a wolf spotting an injured deer. "So if the lake level drops, her lenders panic, the investors bail, and she goes belly up." Rebecca tapped the paper with her pen. "Faster than you'd believe. Her house of cards would collapse in weeks." The room fell silent as the realization settled. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Vivian hadn't just tried to ruin me. She'd gambled the entire region's economy on a fantasy resort built on borrowed money, and she was willing to destroy my family's legacy to prop up her illusion. I felt the weight of it pressing down. Not guilt, but responsibility. "If we move forward," I said slowly, "we're detonating a financial nuke in the middle of Thornfield." "Garrett," Rebecca said gently, "she's already holding the detonator. You're just redirecting the blast." That night, we held our first full war council in my cabin. The rain battered the tin roof in a steady rhythm as schematics, loan agreements, and environmental filings covered every surface. Marcus brought the dam's maintenance manuals and auxiliary spillway diagrams. "This system," he said, tracing a finger along the cross-section, "lets us lower the southern basin by 8 to 12 feet. That's Vivian's side of the lake. The northern basin, where the old-timers' cabins are, stays practically untouched." I leaned over, double-checking his math. He wasn't wrong. Walt poured whiskey into mismatched mugs. "Surgical precision," he muttered. "Love it." But Eleanor Murphy, retired English teacher turned community organizer, raised the question I'd been dreading. What about collateral damage? She asked softly. Lowering the southern basin affects everyone on that side, not just Vivian. You're talking about stranding docks, drying out coves. People will lose access. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I know, and it's the only thing that's kept me up at night. But Eleanor, listen, we've run the numbers. Dropping the levels short term actually benefits the ecosystem. It'll improve fish spawning, reduce algae blooms, and give us a chance to fix shoreline erosion before it gets worse. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then we make this about stewardship, not sabotage. Exactly. Eleanor would spearhead the public narrative, framing the drainage as environmental restoration rather than retaliation. Marcus would provide official cover, filing his inspection reports and pushing through state approvals like clockwork. Rebecca would lock down every legal angle, making sure not even Vivian's army of lawyers could touch us. And Walt would make sure nobody laid a finger on the dam. The next week, we launched a grassroots campaign Eleanor called Restore Thornfield Lake. She hosted kitchen meetings, invited families over for coffee and pie, and handed out pamphlets explaining how lowering the lake was part of returning to traditional water management practices. Her language was perfect. We weren't fighting Vivian. We were protecting the lake's natural heritage. Meanwhile, Walt's surveillance team confirmed Vivian's project was already on the edge. Contractors were behind schedule, investors were getting nervous, and Vivian herself barely holding it together. She's making midnight calls to lenders, Walt reported one evening, scrolling through intercepted public filings and utility usage logs. I'm telling you, she's desperate. She's one wrong move away from collapse. I took a slow sip of coffee, staring at the dam's schematic pinned to the wall. Then let's give her that wrong move, I said quietly. Because in 6 weeks, Vivian planned a grand opening weekend designed to impress investors, influencers, and state officials, complete with fireworks, yacht tours, and a pre-sold $400,000 in vacation packages. If, on that weekend, the lake's shoreline vanished beneath 8 feet of exposed mud, she wouldn't just lose Oni. She'd lose everything. The plan was coming together. The team was locked in. And Vivian? She had no idea the war she'd started was about to end. But before we could move, we had to deal with a new problem. The State Environmental Board scheduled an unexpected emergency inspection, tipped off by someone concerned about suspicious dam activity. Vivian wasn't done playing dirty. The morning started gray and damp, the kind of weather where fog clings to the lake like a secret. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when Marcus's truck pulled up, tires crunching on the gravel drive. He didn't even bother to knock, just came straight in, his boots leaving wet tracks on the hardwood floor. We've got a problem, he said flatly. I set my mug down. Define problem. He dropped a folder on the table, the official state seal stamped across the top. Emergency inspection, Marcus said. Environmental board sending a team tomorrow. Somebody tipped them off about unpermitted dam modifications. Walt, perched on the windowsill cleaning his revolver, purely for sentimental reasons, he claimed, let out a low whistle. Gee, I wonder who that somebody could be. I clenched my jaw. Vivian. Of course it was her. Rebecca arrived 15 minutes later, storming through the cabin door like a general marching onto the battlefield. She scanned the folder, her lips tightening. Okay, she said, dropping into the chair across from me. This isn't fatal. Annoying, yes, but manageable. Manageable how? I asked. She pointed at Marcus. We turn this inspection into a weapon. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Go on. Simple, Rebecca explained. Marcus, you conduct the inspection. You're the county environmental inspector after all. You file an official report citing elevated algae levels, fish spawning disruptions, shoreline erosion, all perfectly factual. And you recommend temporary drawdown to restore ecological balance. Walt chuckled. So we make the inspection justify draining the lake. Exactly, Rar, Rebecca said. Once that report hits the state database, it triggers automatic compliance procedures. That means nobody, not Vivian, not her lawyers, not even the governor's office, can stop us without proving environmental harm. And since lowering the lake actually improves spawning grounds and reduces algae, Marcus added. They can't touch us, Rebecca finished. smirking. For the first time that morning, I felt my lungs expand fully. This wasn't just defense anymore. This was offense. By noon the next day, the Environmental Board's white SUVs rolled into Thornfield, their green emblems reflecting off the wet pavement. 4 inspectors in official windbreakers stepped out, clipboards in hand. I met them at the dam with Marcus, Eleanor, and Walt, all playing their assigned roles perfectly. Eleanor charmed them with homemade muffins and hot coffee. "So glad you're here," she said sweetly. "We've been so worried about the lake's health." Marcus led them through the inspection like a seasoned conductor directing a symphony. He showed them the problem areas we'd carefully prepared: algae blooms photographed weeks earlier, shoreline erosion near Vivian's resort, and spawning nests already threatened by overdevelopment. "This lake's on a knife's edge," Marcus said gravely, gesturing at a set of laminated charts Rebecca had printed. "Unchecked construction is choking the ecosystem. We need to lower water levels temporarily to restore balance." One inspector frowned thoughtfully. "Would that affect existing properties?" Marcus nodded. "Some docks will lose access short-term, yes. But the long-term benefits are undeniable. Without intervention, we'll see mass fish die-offs by August." Eleanor, right on cue, added softly, "We're just trying to protect our home." I watched their faces carefully. By the time the inspection wrapped, 3 of the 4 inspectors were nodding along like preachers at a revival. Rebecca filed Marcus's report that same evening, embedding it directly into the state's regulatory database. By sunrise, our drawdown request had been marked priority urgent and moved into automatic approval status. Vivian had fired her shot. We'd turned it into our biggest advantage yet. That weekend, Walt called with an update. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "Vivian's losing her damn mind. She's on the phone screaming at her contractors, threatening lawsuits, the whole 9 yards." I leaned back on the porch railing, watching mist drift off the lake's surface. "Good," I said simply. "She's trying to call in favors with her investors too," Walt continued. "Problem is, some of them saw Marcus's inspection report already. Word's spreading fast. They're spooked." That was the real domino. Investors didn't care about community drama, but the moment environmental compliance risk showed up on a project summary, money vanished like smoke in the wind. Vivian's war chest was shrinking, her timeline collapsing. But we weren't celebrating yet. Because Memorial Day weekend, her grand opening, was just 4 weeks away. And that's when we'd drop the hammer. The next phase of the plan required precision. Marcus and I spent nights combing through the dam's original schematics, pages yellowed and frayed at the edges, drawn up by engineers who'd built things to last. "The auxiliary spillways are the key," Marcus said, tracing one with his finger. "We open just these 2 gates, and the southern basin drops 8 to 12 feet over 36 hours. Controlled. Predictable." "And we can keep the northern basin stable?" I asked. Marcus nodded confidently. 80% of old-timer properties won't lose dock access." Walt leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I'll handle operational security. Anyone gets within 100 dread yards of those spillway controls without authorization, they'll wish they hadn't." Eleanor, meanwhile, had doubled down on the community campaign. Her coffee meetings turned into living room summits. Parents, retirees, weekenders, everyone was starting to see the drawdown not as sabotage, but salvation. By the end of the month, we had 73 households signed on in support. And Vivian? She was too busy trying to save her collapsing empire to notice we'd just surrounded her on every front. But then came the twist none of us expected. Vivian hired a private security firm, not just for the resort, for the dam itself. Walt broke the news one night, his face grim. "They're ex-military, Garrett, professional, armed. She knows what we're planning." And suddenly, everything became much more dangerous. The first time I saw Vivian's private security detail, I knew this wasn't just an HOA feud anymore. They arrived on a Tuesday morning in 2 matte black SUVs with tinted windows, rolling past my cabin like a presidential motorcade. Each vehicle had discreet but unmistakable antenna rigs, communications-grade hardware, not tourist junk. The men who stepped out weren't rent-a-cops. They moved like predators, scanning every angle, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. Walt stood next to me on the porch, chewing sunflower seeds like it was an old war habit. He spat one shell onto the gravel and muttered, "Ex-military. I'd bet my Purple Heart on it." One of them, tall, squared shoulders, hair cropped regulation short, lingered near the lead SUV, hand resting casually on a holstered sidearm. He didn't look at us, didn't have to. "They're guarding the dam," I said slowly, putting the pieces together. Walt nodded. "She knows, Garrett. Somehow she knows." 2 hours later, Eleanor stormed into my cabin like a woman possessed, slamming her wicker basket onto the table hard enough to rattle the coffee mugs. "Do you know what they just told me?" she said, cheeks flushed red with fury. "Vivian filed for a private security easement with the county, claiming your dam is critical infrastructure for her resort project. She's saying her men have legal authority to restrict access to the spillways." I rubbed my temples. She can't claim an easement on property she doesn't own. Rebecca, who had been sitting cross-legged on my couch reviewing contracts, didn't even look up. "No, she can't. But she can stall. And stalling gives her time to get an injunction." "Which she'll lose," I said. "Eventually," Rebecca replied, finally glancing up at me, "but not before Memorial Day." That was her game. Delay us until after her grand opening. Once the resort was operational, she'd buy, pulling in 6 figures a week in booking revenue, more than enough leverage to steamroll any environmental compliance orders. We were running out of time. That night, our little resistance council gathered around the big oak table in my cabin. Marcus spread out the dam schematics. Walt kept his revolver within reach like always. Eleanor passed out her famous molasses cookies to calm everyone's nerves, and Rebecca scribbled legal strategies on yellow pads. "Let's assume Vivian knows our play," Rebecca began. "She knows we're going to use Marcus's inspection report to justify a controlled drawdown. She knows we've got community backing. So why station security at the dam unless she thinks she can physically stop us?" Walt cracked his knuckles. "Because she's desperate." "She's also dangerous," Marcus added grimly. "Those guys she hired aren't mall cops. They're ex-special forces. I recognize their insignias. Vivian's not bluffing anymore." I looked around the table, weighing my next words carefully. "Then we stop bluffing too." The room went silent. I leaned forward, tracing my finger along the schematic. "There's a secondary access point here," I said, tapping a faintly drawn line near the western embankment. "It's covered by 30 years of brush and runoff, but my grandfather built a manual override system. You can bypass the main controls entirely and open the auxiliary spillways from the lower tunnels." Marcus's head snapped up. "That's still operational?" I nodded. "Granddad designed it for emergencies. Flood events, power failures, sabotage attempts. We used to test it every spring when I was a kid. It'll work." Rebecca frowned. "But if Vivian's got her mercenaries guarding the main controls, how do we get past them without escalating this into an armed conflict?" Walt grinned, the kind of grin that made my stomach knot. "Leave that to me." Over the next 3 nights, we turned my cabin into a war room. Maps covered the walls, aerial photographs lay scattered across the table, and Marcus ran simulations on his battered old laptop, calculating water levels, erosion risks, and downstream impacts to the decimal point. Meanwhile, Walt worked on what he called distractions. "Smoke bombs?" Eleanor asked skeptically one night as he unpacked a duffel bag full of homemade gadgets. "Technically, yes," Walt said, smirking. "But I prefer to call them visual persuasion tools. Nobody gets hurt, everybody gets confused, and we get our 30 minutes of breathing room." Eleanor folded her arms. "You're insane." Walt winked. "You say that like it's news." The final piece fell into place when Marcus called me at midnight, voice low and urgent. "Just got off the phone with my guy at the county registry," he whispered. "Vivian filed a motion for emergency injunction against any modifications to the dam. Court date's in 2 weeks, but she's already petitioned for a temporary freeze order." "How long until it's enforceable?" I asked. 72 hours. I closed my eyes. That was it. We had 3 days to drain the lake, or lose everything. The next morning, I stood at the edge of the dam as fog rolled off Lake Thornfield, the sun rising behind me like a burning promise. The air smelled of wet pine and possibility. I whispered it aloud, just to hear the words. 3 days. Walt stepped up beside me, hands in his jacket pockets, and followed my gaze across the glittering expanse of water. You ready for this? He asked quietly. I thought of my grandfather's stone bridge, of Sarah's laughter echoing across the water, of everything Vivian had already destroyed. More than ready, I said. Behind us, Vivian's mercenaries watched silently from the road, their mirrored sunglasses hiding whatever calculations were running behind their cold stares. They thought they had control. They had no idea what was coming. The clock was ticking. We had less than 72 hours before Vivian's injunction froze any modifications to the dam. If that happened, her 1.8 Muller resort would open on schedule, and our lake, our memories, would belong to her greed forever. The plan was simple on paper but suicidal in practice. Marcus and I would slip into the western access tunnel, bypassing the main controls entirely, while Walt and Eleanor staged a distraction to draw Vivian's security detail away. Rebecca would monitor police frequencies from my cabin, ready to tip us off if Vivian tried anything legal mid-operation. It had to be clean, quiet, perfect. The night before, we gathered at my cabin for what felt like a final briefing. Once you open the auxiliary spillways, Marcus said, tapping the map with a calloused finger, we'll drop water levels by 4 feet in the first hour. That's enough to ground her docks and make the resort non-operational. Full drainage takes about 36 hours. Eleanor shifted nervously. And what happens if Vivian finds us before we're done? I answered for him. Then we've got a lake full of angry lawyers, mercenaries, and God knows what else. But she won't find us. Walt grinned from the corner, holding up a small tin of what looked like silver marbles. That's what these are for. Rebecca frowned. Please tell me those aren't grenades. He popped one open, revealing a pungent cloud of thick smoke. Just homemade foggers. Confuse the cameras, blind the guards, buy us time. Marcus muttered, or kill us from inhalation. Nah, Walt said cheerfully. You'll just cough up a lung or two. Builds character. Nobody laughed. Dawn crept across Lake Thornfield like a living thing, sunlight glinting off the still surface as fog curled around the treetops. The air carried that metallic taste of stormwater, heavy and electric. Vivian's SUVs were parked along the dam road, 4 mercenaries patrolling the perimeter. Through binoculars, I watched one of them lazily adjust his rifle strap. They're jumpy, Walt whispered beside me. Good. Jumpy men make mistakes. Rebecca's voice crackled softly through the radio. All county frequencies are quiet. No court order's been filed yet. You're clear. For now. I adjusted my pack, nodded to Marcus, and we slipped into the tree line. The western tunnel was hidden beneath 3 decades of overgrowth, its rusted steel hatch camouflaged by ivy and moss. My grandfather and I used to come here when I was a boy, crawling through the narrow shaft with flashlights to test the safety systems. Back then, it had felt like an adventure. Now, it felt like war. I brushed away the vines and spun the corroded wheel lock. The hinges groaned in protest as the hatch creaked open, exhaling a breath of stale, damp air. Marcus shined his flashlight inside, muttering, "You're sure this works?" I smirked faintly. It worked when Nixon was president. That's good enough for me. While we descended into the darkness, Walt and Eleanor made their move. From my earpiece came Eleanor's sharp voice. Okay, we're in position. Seconds later, plumes of thick gray smoke erupted near Vivian's SUVs, rolling low across the ground like ghostly fog. One mercenary shouted, another cursed, and all 4 sprinted toward the commotion. Showtime, Walt whispered, his tone dripping with mischief. Marcus and I crawled through the low, claustrophobic passage until we reached the control chamber. The override levers sat embedded in the wall. Massive iron bars connected to ancient hydraulic valves, each marked with my grandfather's meticulous engravings. Marcus checked his calculations one last time. Pull the left first, wait 30 seconds, then the right. Any faster and we risk destabilizing the embankment. I rested my hand on the cold steel. My chest tightened. For a moment, I could hear Sarah's laughter again, floating across the water. I saw my grandfather's worn hands guiding mine as a boy. I felt the weight of generations pressing down on me, and then I pulled. The ground trembled. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the chamber as thousands of gallons surged into the spillway. Above us, alarms wailed. The lake was bleeding. Rebecca's voice came over the radio, sharp and breathless. "Garrett, the water levels are dropping. Fast, you're doing it." But then another voice cut across hers, distorted and furious. "Vivian, you're finished, Donovan. You shut that dam right now, or I swear—" "Or what?" I growled into the mic. "You'll destroy my bridge again? Not this time." By dusk, the transformation was undeniable. The once glimmering resort sat perched above a widening expanse of mud and rock, its private docks hanging awkwardly over receding shallows. Boats lay tilted like broken toys, useless and abandoned. Vivian arrived in her white Tesla, stilettos sinking into the muck as she screamed at her mercenaries to do something. But there was nothing left to do. The county sheriff arrived minutes later with court orders. My court orders, backed by the state environmental agency. Vivian had overplayed her hand. By midnight, her security detail was gone. 6 months later, I stood on my grandfather's restored stone bridge, watching the most spectacular sunrise Lake Thornfield had seen in decades. The water was clear again, teeming with fish. Kids laughed along the banks where her fences once stood. Vivian? Gone. Bankrupt. Facing criminal charges for property damage and conspiracy. The HOA, rebuilt from the ground up, now focused on conservation and community, not control. As mist rose from the lake, I felt Sarah's presence beside me, as real as the warmth of the rising sun. For the first time in years, I breathed without bitterness. This wasn't just my victory. It was our legacy. I whispered softly to the water. Some things are worth more than money. They're worth everything, and Lake Thornfield, at last, was ours again.